Hi, welcome back to an Inspector Calls Act 2 Part 2. So we're picking up the interrogation of Mrs Birling, where we've just learnt that she has a charity that looks after or supports working class women. And what we get in between this is reference to Eric. So I've just put in bold here when Eric is referenced. So they're wondering where he is. He's gone out, he's come back. And I've highlighted in bold, but not colour-coded it because I think it's just something to refer to. But Mrs Birling's still referring to her son as silly boy. So someone who's quite young. Her view of him has, it's not very knowing about her own child, who's an adult really in his 20s. And also she doesn't even know where he is. And I think that's in there on purpose, that the parents are so unaware of their own children, where they are, what they've been up to. And we know that from earlier when they didn't even know that he drank quite a lot. So again, worth recognising that Priestley puts this in on purpose during this interrogation. So the only little thing to spot on here is the inspector's use of the adverb truthfully, because again, this is all linking to the intention of Priestley. He references the fact that Mr. Croft, Gerald Croft, was really truthful in his interrogation about what happened between himself and Eva Smith. And I think that's the point that is trying to be made here by Priestley, is that just acknowledge the truth, take responsibility, all links into that message. And then we get this shock plot point that Mrs Birling was the last person to speak and see Eva Smith. And that is there in the inspector's point. So that's why it's in bold. Okay, so this is where Mrs Birling now really starts to kind of explain what happened, but she's very defensive. So we find out that obviously Eva Smith has given her a different name, has given a third name, but this time she said that she is Mrs Birling, which immediately has made Mrs Birling quite angry, because names linked to family and reputation and heritage and all of that kind of social climbing, upper class privilege, of which Mrs Birling's taken immediate offence. And we can see that in what she says here. A piece of gross impertinence. She uses that word a lot to mean that it's disgraceful and rude, and how dare she. And she admits being prejudiced because of that. And the inspector picks up on it. So, you admit to being prejudiced, you admit to not helping her properly. But Mrs Birling, and you'll see this all the way through, absolutely refuses to take responsibility. She only had herself to blame. There's no way Mrs Birling is going to admit to what she's done. And then at the bottom here, you can see in purple, I've just highlighted some of the things we've learned about what Eva Smith said. So she first tells Mrs Birling that the first story she gives as why she's there is that she's got a husband who deserted her. And what we get there is a sense that we know that's not true, that she's maybe protecting somebody else, or there's a reason that this story has existed. But that's the first story that she tells. In this section here, what I've highlighted is how many times Mrs Birling refuses to admit what she's done. I did nothing I'm ashamed of. I used my influence to have it refused. You have no power to make me change my mind. There's so much arrogance in what Mrs Birling says here, and she's so adamant that she's not going to change or develop or improve or do anything that is going to affect her reputation, which she is determined to keep, even when she says, I've done nothing wrong. And the inspector in pink here is really trying to fight back against Mrs Birling, and you can see the repetition here when Mrs Birling says, I've done nothing wrong, and the inspector says, I think you did something terribly wrong. Look at the use of the word terribly there on purpose. He's really saying, look, this is disgusting and disgraceful. And here's the hope, really, that the inspector really wants her to recognise that she should regret it, because this is someone who has died. Okay. And then we get the shock factor at the end, which is why it's in purple. We then learn, and this is important that it's left to this point, Eva Smith was going to have a child.